Welcome to the show. This is the Energy Roundtable, part of the series for the Aaron Harber Show, and we're talking about the moral cases for and against fossil fuels. So, Alex, one of the really interesting kind of dichotomies that you had posed is the idea of being transformational, and what should we do for humans versus people you think are who believe, shall I say, that the planet would be better off without us. Is that a fair statement? And why can't there be a middle ground? Why can't you be a person who wants to be transformational, but at the same time says, if there's a cost to nature of something we do, we should incorporate that cost into our thinking. Isn't that a fair way?
Let me try to summarize how I would put it, and then I'll explain why I think there's an either or at least if you don't follow the pure humanist view, you guarantee that human beings suffer and die unnecessarily. So when we're making a decision in life, ultimately we have some ultimate reason that we're citing as the reason why we do X versus Y. And so my view is that decision should be based on human well-being. That's the yardstick. Now that doesn't mean that you ignore the rest of nature, you don't care about it. In fact, you pay very close attention to things like the any potential negatives of CO2 in the atmosphere. You explore everything related to human life. You're incredibly interested in it, and you want to be interested in it in a very precise way, as I've mentioned. But your ultimate goal is you want human beings to be doing as well as possible. Now, unfortunately, that is not the only view on this issue. Another view is that instead of focusing on human beings, we should focus on, quote, the planet. But what does that mean, the planet? The planet means really non-human beings. It means focusing on the rest of nature. And the idea of being green has really popularized this ideal, which says instead of maximizing human well-being, we should minimize human impact. So we're taught that to think of everything in life in terms of minimizing impact. Now you might say, can't we have negative impacts? Sure, but the humanist avoids impacts that are negative for human beings, short-term and long-term. But what he embraces is the many positive impacts we make on the earth. And if you want to bring up something like Pope Francis, who has had recently a major role in discussing this, he describes the earth as we've made it as an immense pile of filth. Now, that is not a humanist perspective, because if you go to the Pope 300 years ago and you take the environment he lived in, the planet he lived on, that is not an immense pile of filth. That was an immense pile of filth compared to today. So we are overall improvers of the planet for human beings. I don't want to save the planet from human beings. I want to improve it for human beings, and I don't compromise one iota on human well-being thought of in a big picture way. And I think the vast majority of our culture has been taught to compromise vastly, and that's why we're considering dramatically, forcibly reducing our best sources of energy. And that's why we have this bias against nuclear, because it's considered unnatural. That's why we have a bias against hydro. It's a real curse on human beings that we are trying to minimize our impact instead of maximize our well-being.
Chris.
Yeah, so everything is trade-offs, right? Yeah, when we grow food, do we impact that land? Absolutely. The biggest human impact on the planet by far and away is food production. But we're all in favor of eating. We wouldn't be alive without it. We make those trade-offs. The question is, and the sort of the fundamental premise so far has been that hydrocarbons are this terrible for the environment, and we're arguing whether it's worth that terribleness or not, or some of us are arguing that. Look at the history of hydrocarbons and the history of the human condition. So in 1800, the world was 100% renewable energy, dominantly biofuels, as 1 billion people today still are. And then what happened? We shifted over to cleaner burning whale oil, right? So to use lighting as an analogy, right? So we burned whale oil. Whale oil production peaked in about 1850. It declined. We almost extincted the large whales in the major oceans of the world. What happened? Oil came and saved that. Prior to oil coming and displacing the killing of whales and seals and all that for oil, was look at England. Everyone been to England? It's wet and lush and has almost no forest. Why is that? Because humans cut down those trees to cook food and keep themselves warm. coal arrived too late for England. Western Europe would be entirely deforested if not for the arrival of coal. So people say coal's dirty and it's awful. It's compared to what? Compared to what? So here we're talking about future speculation. If we had windmills and solar panels, energy would be cheaper and the impact would be wildly smaller. I don't think the data supports that. The history, they said the same thing in the 1970s. If it's true, I'm all for it. And as I said, I'm probably the only one on the panel that's worked on these alternative energy technologies. I'm for them. Wind's biggest problem is just the gigantic amount of land it uses for a relatively small amount of intermittent energy. If we look at the energy consumption the world consumed last year and the energy consumption the world uses this year, just that delta, just that increase in energy, to supply that with wind power would take the entire nation of Germany and make a wind farm out of it. I'm not sure that's a good trade-off.
Chris, I have worked on renewable energy. In fact, a project that we put onto the distribution system in San Isabel Electric Association co-op down near Walsenburg won the 2014 DOE prize for best wind project, so yay. So I know about that too.
I had a caveat of technology, alternative energy technology. I know you've worked
And I
in
know
the field.
about the technology as well. But here's what I'd like to say. Here's what I think that I can agree with both of you on, and that this is that we should thank fossil fuels for where it got us. And I really like the way you said this, Alex. You said if what we should be doing right now, if we decide not to use fossil fuels, is to sort of have a sense of sorrow about it, be sorry. So personally, I've lived through this. I got my law degree in '75, right before the Arab oil embargo. I was there for the Natural Gas Policy Act, the deregulation of natural gas. I have lived through a very robust period in our life where we grabbed as a nation fossil fuels and said we wanted domestic production. But now I'm ready. It's like a toxic relationship. I'm ready to say it once was good and it's now doesn't work anymore, and I'm sorry.
So I'm really interested in the concept that it doesn't work anymore, because clearly we've increased our use of fossil fuels, yet we have more people on the planet. More people are healthier. They have better food. They have better access to medical care. Their homes are heated. Their offices are heated and cooled, et cetera. And clearly our fossil fuel use has increased dramatically. Our environment, as a rule, is cleaner than it has been. So the numbers seem to be saying something really different. And correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, this isn't going to occur overnight. I mean, we talk like we're in a hermetically sealed jar here. We need to start making the transitions. Actually, wind energy is cheaper than any other form of energy as of today. As of today. Now, solar isn't, but it's getting there. And it has none of the external consequences and impacts that fossil fuels do.
Is that true? Do you feel that's true?
I know that's bizarre.
Well, his notion of humanism is something I do not understand.
Listen,
Erasmus would turn over in his grave if he heard that definition of humanism. I mean, that's
let's drop humanism. Let's look at simply.
I'm selfish on behalf of the species. That's
Let's look at just cost. Let's just cost. So is what Phil said true? Is that accurate?
No. The biggest embracers of wind power, was first Denmark and Germany, now the United Kingdom. All of them have dramatically higher electricity rates than the U.S. and dramatically higher electricity rates than before they went down that path. So the closest example of what this Stanford study is, as we mentioned, is Germany, right? So Germany, they passed Denmark and Japan to that distinction of the highest electricity prices in the world. And what have they done for CO2 emission reductions? So in the last 10 years, the meat of they call it their energy wind or Vind. In the last 10 years, in the heart of that, their CO2 emissions in the country have dropped by 8%. Ours have dropped by 10%. On a per capita basis, ours are lower than any year since I was born.
And that's mainly due to our switch from coal for utilities to natural gas.
Well, and we sell all our manufacturing to Asia. But I mean, we don't manufacture anything.
So
we're off course here. We're not talking about the moral case for fossil fuels. We're criticizing Germany for a plan that the Germans decided to do. And I heard a German at a conference at DU the other day vehemently defend that plan and said, we're entitled to do what we want to do. What I think we need to look at is if billions of people on this planet don't have access to electricity and to refrigeration and to the things that you mentioned in your book about Babies are born, but they can't go into an incubator because the electric supply is faulty. And if fossil fuels have been around for 100 years, what's the problem? Why do we have billions of people with no electricity? Why do we have a blackout at night over most of Africa? So there seems to me to be an ethical consideration about energy equality and how we hold human life to be precious and dignified, that we have been unable, even in a fossil fuel regimen, to extend fossil fuels to those people. What's up with that?
Great point, Susan. Great point. People are poor. We all want to see poverty end. So there are 1 billion people without access to electricity today, and there was about 2 billion people 20 years ago. So we've had a huge increase in the availability of electricity, dominantly provided by increase in coal. And yes, those other billion should get energy too, whatever the cheapest and most effective it is.
I'll tell you what's preventing them from getting. Money is what's preventing them, because they don't have a system that will allow them to send money out of their country to buy your coal or to buy your oil or to buy your natural gas. Look at Russia's domination of Europe. Just one more thing.
Well, we're actually done with this segment. So there's always one more thing, and then we'll have to wait to the next segment. So we'll be right back.
Freedom is the root of all prosperity, because what freedom allows is for the creative individual to create value, to transform nature, and to do it in really good ways so that others will pay him for it, so that others will trade. If you look at the countries that become more and more free, as a consequence of the freedom, they pursue the most efficient forms of energy.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbortv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today. Hi, I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Because I've never done endorsements or commercials, people ask how are our programs funded, especially because we provide them as a public service to all our broadcast outlets. It's expensive to produce our show, whether we do them here in Denver or go to places such as Aspen, Washington, D.C., or even Iraq. The answer is we depend on contributions to support our work to bring you some of the nation's top opinion leaders. Individuals, businesses, foundations, and other nonprofits make tax-deductible contributions to the Democracy and Media Education Foundation to help allow us to continue to work for you. To find out more or to make a donation, just go to dmefd.org. The DMEF is a tax-exempt public charitable organization and has promised to dedicate 100% of every contribution to support our public affairs initiatives. If you believe, as I do, in the need for a forum which promotes civil discourse and mutually respectful discussion, I hope you'll decide to make a contribution today.
Join me and watch The Aaron Harber Show.
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 I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch The Aaron Harber Show and Keep Hope Alive.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at www.harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the moral cases for and against fossil fuels with Chris Wright and Alex Epstein and Suzanne Perkins and, not to be mentioned last, Phil Doe. All right, so we were talking about the fact that there are a billion people without energy, and I'd like your comment on that, Alex.
Yeah, and part of the issue that was raised is why didn't that happen with fossil fuels? You're so pro-fossil fuels. Why didn't it happen with fossil fuels? So first of all, the quote-unquote renewable technologies are mostly older than the fossil fuels technology. I mean, windmills have been around since those are Middle Ages energy. Solar panel technology has been around for a long time. So none of these things are quote-unquote. It's not like, oh, we just discovered something new in fossil fuels.
They've been burning coal for a long time.
Yeah, no, for sure. But we're thinking of this on the wrong level. So the level to think about it, and don't think you need your sensors here, but we need to think of the F word that is never discussed in the energy debate, and that is freedom. So freedom is the root of all prosperity, because what freedom allows is for the creative individual to create value, to transform nature, and to do it in really good ways so that others will pay him for it, so that others will trade. If you look at the countries that become more and more free, as a consequence of the freedom, they pursue the most efficient forms of energy, and because fossil fuels for most uses are the most efficient, they pursue fossil fuels. But you have to get that the causality is to start out by being free, which is why I'm particularly terrified of these proposals to inject more force in the situation, to force us to use the unreliable unreliables instead of trying to prove them in the market, to force us to try to be green instead of to liberate us to be pro-human in our energy choices. So all you got to do is liberate the world.
Why do 1 billion people not have electricity?
Because billions of people aren't free. There are 3 billion people who have basically no energy. The world is barely free enough. And so when I hear climate change is the biggest challenge of our time, I mentioned why that's bogus terminology. But no, the biggest challenge of our time is lack of human freedom. That's what the focus needs to be. That's the root of the energy problem and any other problem.
Well, you have 300 million people in India without electricity. The reason they don't have electricity is because they're not free, or is it because they're impoverished? Which is it?
How did we get out of poverty? How did we get out of the cave? The caveman was impoverished. Somehow, no, human beings were impoverished basically forever. And then somehow a couple hundred years ago, we became really rich. Now, did we just find some stockpile of money? No, we had freedom. We had political freedom, particularly in Europe and the United States of America. And so we could use our minds to create science, technology, wealth. Freedom is the root of all this prosperity. This is the fact that it's the F word that we barely discuss. It shows how much of a poverty of knowledge we have. So when people talk about justice and equity and energy, no, the fundamental is freedom. People should be free to create the energy that they need. That's the moral thing. That's the just thing.
Yeah, Phil, real quick, it's economic freedom. India does not have the same degree of economic freedom. There's a huge government system to permit entrepreneurs to do things. And so they are growing their freedom right now, which is why more people in India are getting energy, but they don't have nearly the freedom we have or that allowed our country to prosper and become wealthy enough to have energy, the energy of our choice.
But aren't there lots of countries that aren't free that have energy?
In what way? You look at their
Russia has energy. But, yeah.
Right, so there's a mixture of freedom and unfreedom, but what you find is the times at which the energy is developed. So even if you take the history of Russian oil and gas or Mideast oil, it's really interesting because you had no development there until the free countries with their technology came in and figured out how to create those resources from just glop under the ground. You know, in the prize, Daniel Yergin talks about how Saudi Arabia's whole national treasury could fit on the back of a camel before the U.S. and England came over and used ingenuity. So it's the free countries that are leading anything, and to the extent that they're free, they get prosperity.
All right, let me jump to another question. So, Alex, what about, one of the things I don't hear from many people is the whole concept of energy conservation, where clearly my perspective from what I have read as a non-scientist is that we could save a tremendous amount of energy in this country if we used it more wisely and have all the same benefits that we have today. Is that an erroneous conclusion?
It's a trade-off. If you use an extra resource to buy a higher tech, more efficient device, it consumes less energy, but you have to put more capital out to buy it. So when energy prices go up, as they've gone the last 10 years, there's a lot of investment in energy efficiency. When energy is cheap, there's less. But it's not like that energy savings is free. It comes at a capital cost. So the general history of energy consumption is getting more and more efficient. It continues to get more efficient. That's a great thing. But there's no light switch to just change, and all of a sudden we'll have 30% more energy.
Well, you know, central to Rocky Mountain Institute's arguments about our energy future is the idea of conservation. Yep. And it's, you know, what the economists call the low-hanging fruit. It's the easiest thing to do. We insulate our homes, you know, our windows, et cetera, et cetera. It's very central to Mark Jacobson's study on the Solutions Project. I think he calls for 40% reduction in the way we use energy. You can only argue that this is a wash if you don't believe that we're influencing the planet detrimentally. If you don't believe that, then of course it's all a wash. But if you believe,
we didn't say we didn't believe that, and we didn't say it was a wash. So Phil, speak more clearly.
Okay,
and just to be clear, the Stanford.
Alex doesn't believe it.
I believe what Chris said. I said.
And I believe what I said that I said.
And going off of what Phil just said about the 40% energy efficiency included in the Stanford study, actually only 9% of that is actually energy efficiency as we know it. The other 31% is the relative efficiency of electric motors over other types of combustion.
Okay, but then you get into the question of where do you get the electricity in the first place?
Yeah, that's a dishonest statistic, right? Because it is because but you think about there's a power plant. So efficiency is used in all these weird ways, but essentially there's what's called a BTU conversion efficiency whenever you're generating the electricity. So wherever you generate it from, you get a certain percentage of that. Now, once you refine it to electricity, sure, you stick it in a battery. The battery holds 90% of that. But the question is, what was the efficiency on the coal? What was the efficiency on the wind? What was the efficiency on
what you really
the solar?
want to look at is the life life cycle efficiency from extraction
And that's what
to use or whatever the case
Chris's
may
point
be.
is so profoundly important. I'll put it a slightly different way, which is that we want to look at our overall resource efficiency. You can't take one resource out of context and say, let's just be energy efficient, because then you could be making other things more expensive or even more dangerous. So for instance, you have some people who over-insulate their homes and subject themselves to worse air quality or other kinds of things. So what you need to do is focus on maximizing human well-being, and the way to do that is to leave people free. Most of these analyses
18 million people died from air quality problems last year, according to the World Health Organization. Almost half from outside. There are air quality problems dealing with mostly with fossil fuel use.
Phil, how many people did you say?
8 million.
8 million died from what?
From air quality problems.
Yeah,
It's
and
the
so
World Health.
more than half of them is from indoor air pollution from people that don't have modern energy, right? They're burning sticks, grass, and dung inside, so
Fossil
very high
fuels.
mortality rate there.
Using kerosene for lights.
Using fossil fuels in any old way is this magical thing that we should do blindly. The idea is we should have a free society where we're free to pursue the best forms of energy, including fossil fuels, with rational laws against minimizing pollution and endangerment. And that the same, by the way, the other sources of energy, I heard this thing about, wind has no negative externalities. Yeah, what about all the people who die in China from mining the materials for wind? So every form of energy should be treated in the same way, and they should compete, but we have to recognize that fossil fuels are a massive value, and anyone who tries to restrict them is a massive threat to human life.
You got to look at the statistics on deaths from coal mining in China. If you want something to really blow your head off, look at that.
Okay, and we will. So we'll take a break, and we'll be right back.
What made life better in the 20th century, despite it being the bloodiest century of all time, was the innovations in science and medicine. And it seems to me that those are more important to the well-being of the human species, at least, than fossil fuels.
Your opinions, ideas, suggestions, and criticisms related to guests, topics, questions, or the host are welcome. Please send an email to producer@harbortv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbortv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching. Hi, I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. It's tough for me to limit myself to 140 characters, but you can see how well I do by following the show on Twitter. Follow me at @Aaron Harber.
To obtain a DVD copy of this program, please contact info@harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show, our final segment in our series on the moral cases for and against fossil fuels. So, Phil, off camera during the break, tell us what you were talking about.
To my mind, what made life better in the 20th century, despite it being the bloodiest century of all time, was the innovations in science and medicine. And it seems to me that those are more important to the well-being of the human species, at least, than fossil fuels.
All of these things are interrelated. So it's not just fossil fuels as this isolated variable and everything. The oil magically flows into your veins and makes you live longer or something like that. But it's really important to understand how fundamental energy and therefore the cheapest, most plentiful, most reliable sources of energy are to everything in our lives. And I think it's underappreciated. And the reason I wanted Phil to make that comment was because I think he's underappreciating it. So let's look at medicine. Why did medical science grow so much so recently? There are a bunch of reasons, but the number one thing you need to practice medical science or any science is time, right? You need time to think, time to do experiments, time to test, time to explore. Now, why didn't people 300 years ago do those kinds of things? Well, one big reason was they had no time because they lived in a manual labor economy, not a machine labor economy. Once you have a machine labor economy, you can delegate your physical work to the machines, and then you can spend your time doing intellectual work, which is great on two levels. One, you can figure out how to make the machines better, and two, you can learn all of these intellectual scientific things that you couldn't otherwise learn. So every scientist in their lab and every academic in their university should get down every day and thank the fossil fuel industry and the rest of the energy energy industry for giving them the time to do these amazing things. And when I see a new cure, I know 100%, like friends of mine having their lives saved, I know 100% that the energy industry gave us the time to do that. And if we liberate it, it'll give us more time to do that. So we have a future where we have faster and faster innovation because we have more and more time to think.
All right. Fascinating point. What do you think of that, Phil?
I don't agree. I mean, I think that there'll be hundreds of millions of people that thank us if we get rid of CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. They'll live longer. I think, we're up against a future that is really, really dim if we don't start controlling our appetites. This is about controlling appetite. That's all it's about. It's not the end of the world unless we don't do anything.
All right, so Phil, I want to think something. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
So two questions. Number one, how do you get the poor people of the world to not have an appetite to want more energy? Because, quick data,
it's a big problem.
The U.S. CO2 emissions in gross level, not correcting for population, peaked 10 years ago and are declining.
Right.
European CO2 emissions are declining. So the only where that CO2 emissions are growing is poor people getting increased access to energy. But you don't want them to. You want them to subdue those urges.
No, I don't. That's not what I said. I think that they have to go to new forms of energy that are available. And I mean, think about the carbon load that you would create if all 300 million people in India were to get electricity from coal. And it's even worse in
Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, Africa, they don't, but they're using solar panels. We were talking about, as opposed to kerosene for lighting. But if you go to Bangladesh, we may not have to worry about it, maybe all underwater, but they'll all be coming here and they're Muslims, so we should be worried about that. I'm joking, of course. But I think in Bangladesh, there's something like 700 million people that don't have electricity. I mean,
I don't think the population.
Well, it's
The
pretty
population
close.
is less than half of that.
Like
But Phil, I think we're somewhat on the same page here.
Well,
And
it's
so
300 million in India for sure.
Correct. So I think we're on the same page of where we want to get. It's kind of how to get there. But let's look at, again, there's been a huge effort. It's not just today. It's not a new thing. It's a huge effort. I threw out the number 1.3 trillion in subsidies to work on it. So 20 years ago, since the start of that $1.3 trillion, the world got about 13% of its energy from non-carbon sources.
Right.
And today, we get 13% of our energy from non-carbon sources. So it's a very hard problem. We will continue to work on it. All of us on this panel will continue to work on it. But there's not this magical light switch that it just arrives.
Right. But one advantage they have is that they're not reliant on a form of energy that we are. So we can make that change much more easily, it seems to me, if we go to renewables rather than going back to the same old model that Alex thinks isn't dangerous.
The developing nations have roughly the same mix of energy as we do. They get roughly 85% of their energy from hydrocarbons as well. So they actually don't have a different mix than we do.
The ones without electricity do because they don't have it.
We're about to end the show.
Okay. Well, my point is that this country, the developed countries, are responsible for loading the environment with CO2. So if you look at our contribution currently versus our historical contribution, you would get about 20% responsibility for the United States, 20% for Europe, and 10% for China. If those three entities got together and said, we are going to cut our fossil fuel consumption, and we're going to stimulate the innovation that's necessary to get to 100% renewable, I think we could solve the problem.
You get the final word,
If
Alex.
you look carefully at the big picture and check out the moral case for fossil fuels, I highly recommend it to Phil in particular. If you look at that big picture,
We are going to give Phil a copy.
It is amazing. Well, do more with it. But it is amazingly positive for human life. We can make the world so much better by liberating every form of energy, and the human population can continue to get better, just as it's gotten better as even though the exact views we've heard today about doomsday scenarios, they've been made for the last 35 years. They've fortunately been exactly the opposite of the truth. And if we continue to be free or even freer, they will continue to be wrong. And the next panel may have another set of doomsayers in 35 years, but they'll have a much better world.
Phil, you have a 10-second comment? Are you ready to concede the point?
No, I'm not. Look, all we have to do is look at our carbon budget compared to the rest of the world. Each one of us annually contributes 16 tons of carbon. In India, it's 1.6. In China, it's about 6.
All right, and on
we
that-
use too much energy.
And the plants are very grateful to us.
Oh, well.
All right, we'll talk about that on another show. I want to thank my guests, Chris and Alex, Susan, and Phil. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.